What would you do if the woman you loved was asked to disappear from your life with a single envelope of money, and the person demanding it was your own mother? That morning began with sunlight, coffee, and the kind of quiet domestic peace that makes people believe love has finally earned a place to rest. But before noon, that peace would be shattered by humiliation, accusation, and a warning sharp enough to leave a wound long after the words were spoken. In the small warmth of a village kitchen, Tu Tien would be forced to choose between dignity and fear, while Jack, without knowing it yet, would return home to find that the woman he loved had already stood alone in the first great battle for their future. And what followed was not only pain, it was revelation. Because sometimes love is not tested when two hearts are together in comfort, but when one of them is cornered, judged, and told to walk away. There was something almost sacred about the way the morning had begun. Soft light filtered through the curtains and settled over the modest kitchen, catching on the rim of Tu Tien's coffee cup and warming the wooden table beside her. The house was simple, but it held the kind of comfort that does not come from wealth. It came from repetition, from familiar cups placed in familiar corners, from the quiet rhythm of small chores, from knowing which floorboard creaked, which curtain let in the best light, which corner of the kitchen still carried the scent of last night's meal. It was the peaceful kind of ordinary that people in hard lives value more deeply than anyone else. Tu Tien sat there with both hands around her cup, letting its heat settle into her fingers. She was not doing anything grand or dramatic. She was simply breathing inside a calm moment. And perhaps that is what made what came next feel so cruel. Peace is most fragile when it is finally believed. The knock at the door was not gentle. It arrived hard, sudden, and without patience, breaking through the morning like something that had already decided it belonged there. Before Tu Tien could properly gather herself, the door opened, and Mother Ly stepped in with the force of someone who had not come to visit, but to impose. The older woman did not greet her. She did not wait to be invited inside. She entered the house with a face carved by disapproval and eyes so sharp they seemed to look not at Tu Tien, but through her. There are some people who bring tension with them before they speak a single word. Mother Ly was that kind of presence. The air in the room seemed to shrink around her. Tu Tien rose too quickly, startled enough that the coffee in her cup trembled. Instinctively, she tried to compose herself, but she felt it at once, the hostility, the coldness, the unmistakable sense that this was not a misunderstanding and not a simple family conversation. This was a confrontation already underway. Mother Ly stood in the middle of the kitchen like an accusation given human form. The morning light that had seemed warm only moments before now looked pale and indifferent. The distance between the two women was not large in physical space, but emotionally it was enormous. On one side stood a young woman whose love had grown inside sincerity, labor, and quiet devotion. On the other stood a mother armed with authority, bitterness, and the conviction that love could be measured in damage. She did not waste time with politeness. Her words came sharply, one after another, without softening, without hesitation, without any of the restraint that mercy sometimes brings. She accused Tu Tien directly of pushing her son CEO Jack to the edge of bankruptcy. She spoke as though the entire collapse of his life had a face now, and that face stood in front of her holding a coffee cup in a poor little kitchen. Every sentence landed like a blow, not because Tu Tien believed it was true, but because cruelty, spoken with certainty, can still wound even when it is unjust. For a second, Tu Tien could do nothing but stand there. Her face drained of color, her fingers tightened around the cup until she feared she might drop it. The kitchen, so warm a few minutes earlier, had become something else entirely, an arena where her love was not merely doubted, but put on trial. Mother Ly's gaze was relentless, cutting through every attempt Tu Tien made to remain steady. It was not just anger in those eyes, it was judgment. The judgment of a mother who had already chosen what kind of woman stood before her and had no interest in being corrected. Tu Tien wanted to speak. She wanted to defend Jack, to defend herself, to say that love had not ruined him, that hardship had come from life, from family burdens, from choices heavier than any one person could carry alone. But shock and humiliation have a way of trapping words in the throat. For a moment, the injustice was so great that silence became the only thing she could manage. And Mother Ly mistook that silence for weakness. From her bag, she pulled out a thick envelope and dropped it onto the kitchen table with a force that made the sound feel louder than it should have. It was such a simple motion, and yet it altered the emotional balance of the room completely. Suddenly, the confrontation was no longer just personal. It had become transactional. Brutally, coldly transactional. Mother Ly said the money inside would be enough for Tu Tien to start over somewhere else, far from Jack. Her voice was steady, in the way business voices are steady when they believe a deal should be accepted for practical reasons. There was no softness in it, no hidden sorrow, no trace of pleading. It was an order disguised as an offer. Take this, leave my son, end this. Tu Tien stared at the envelope and felt something in her chest twist painfully. It was not greed she felt, not temptation. It was humiliation, the kind that goes past the surface and settles in the deepest part of a person's dignity. She had not been mistaken for someone in love with comfort. She had been reduced to someone who could be bought away from love entirely. That insult reached somewhere deeper than anger. It struck at her worth, at the meaning of everything she had endured beside Jack, at the long, patient tenderness that had grown between them through hardship, labor, and quiet loyalty. For a few seconds, the room seemed to hold its breath. Mother Ly stood tall, severe, almost regal in her certainty, while Tu Tien stood opposite her, feeling smaller and yet, strangely, stronger. Because there are moments when cruelty does something unexpected. It does not break a person. It reveals them to themselves. The more icy the older woman became, the clearer Tu Tien's own heart grew. Her fear did not disappear, but beneath the fear, something steadier rose. When she finally lifted her head, her voice trembled. But it did not break. She said no, not dramatically, not loudly, but clearly enough that the word changed the room. She refused the money. She refused the order. And then, with tears already gathering in her eyes, she said the one thing that mattered most. She loved Jack. Truly, not for his position, not for money, not for status, not for what the world thought he could provide. She loved the man himself, the man who worried too much, carried too much, tried too hard to protect everyone else, and still came home with kindness in his hands even when life had emptied them. Those words rang through the kitchen with a force that surprised even her. This was no longer a frightened young woman being cornered by a powerful mother. This was someone standing inside humiliation and still choosing loyalty. There is a moment in certain love stories when affection becomes conviction, when devotion stops being gentle and becomes brave. This was that moment for Tu Tien. Mother Ly looked genuinely stunned for a second, as if she had expected crying, begging, bargaining anything except this kind of calm refusal. But the shock passed quickly, replaced by something harsher. Her anger deepened, her face flushed with outrage. To her, Tu Tien's refusal was not noble. It was defiance. Yet for Tu Tien, it was something far more important. It was self-recognition. As she stood there with tears trembling but not yet falling, she understood that love had already changed her. She could still be scared. She could still be wounded by insult. But she was no longer the kind of woman who would step aside simply because someone richer, older, or more powerful demanded it. Jack's image in her heart, the tenderness between them, the shared effort of ordinary days, The burdens they had already started to carry together gave her a kind of strength no money could buy and no threat could undo. Outside the window, the sunlight seemed brighter. Inside the kitchen, Mother Ly snatched the envelope back from the table. Her fingers were tight around it now, as though even the refusal itself had insulted her authority. She turned toward the door, but before leaving, she looked back with a warning so cold it stayed in the air long after she spoke it. Tu Tien would regret this choice. She would regret refusing. She would regret staying. She would regret believing love could withstand what was still to come. Then the door slammed. The sound echoed through the house like the end of a sentence too dark to finish aloud. Only after Mother Ly was gone did Tu Tien allow her body to react honestly. Her hands trembled, her breathing turned shallow. The fear she had held back rushed into the empty room all at once. She lowered herself into the chair and pressed one hand against her chest, as though trying to calm her heart by force. Tears finally came, but they were not the tears of surrender. They were the tears of someone who had just endured something violent without being touched. And this is where the story becomes so emotionally true, because bravery does not always feel triumphant. Sometimes it feels like shaking after the danger has left. Sometimes it feels like crying alone in the kitchen after you have done the hardest thing available to you. The rest of the day moved slowly. The house was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet as before. This was a post-storm quiet, heavy and disturbed, full of the memory of what had been said. Every object in the kitchen seemed unchanged and yet altered. The cup of coffee had gone cold. The chair still stood in the same place. The light still passed over the table. But the room had witnessed something now. It had become the place where Tu Tien's love was tested and where she had chosen, in pain and trembling, not to betray it. By late afternoon, the sunlight had softened into gold. Jack returned home carrying the fatigue of the day without knowing what waited for him inside. He noticed it at once, the change in Tu Tien's face, the traces of tears, the stillness that did not belong to an ordinary day. There are some pains that speak before words do, and he knew immediately that something had happened. When she told him, the hurt in his expression was immediate and deep. He took her hands in both of his and held them tightly, not out of ceremony, but like a man anchoring the person he loves after she has been hit by something cruel. The more he heard, the more sorrow and determination gathered in his eyes. He did not dismiss her feelings. He did not minimize what his mother had done. He did not ask her to be patient in the cowardly way some men do when they are afraid to confront family. Instead, he stood fully inside the truth of the pain and chose his side without hesitation. He told her he would never leave her. There was no drama in the way he said it, and that made it even stronger. He promised to stay beside her for the rest of his life, and in that promise there was something more than romance. There was decision, there was responsibility. There was the quiet weight of a man understanding that love is no longer just about feeling it, is about protection and about who you refuse to abandon when the pressure begins. Tu Tien broke then, but safely this time. Jack pulled her into his arms, and the fear that had wrapped itself around her all day finally began to loosen. He held her the way people hold what they almost cannot bear to see hurt. He wiped away her tears with such gentleness that the wound of the morning softened. Not because it was forgotten, but because it was finally being shared. His voice stayed close to her, warm and steady, saying the kinds of things that restore not just comfort, but dignity. She was not alone. She had done nothing wrong. He knew her heart. He trusted her. Nothing, not money, not pressure, not his mother's anger would erase what they were to each other. That embrace changed the emotional direction of the whole day. What had been humiliation became affirmation. What had been threat became clarity. Mother Ly had come hoping to weaken their bond. Instead, she had forced it into the open, where both of them now had to see it for what it truly was. Not a fragile affection that could be bought or frightened away, but a love already learning how to survive opposition. Evening came quietly after that. And because real love often heals through ordinary things rather than grand speeches, they went into the kitchen together. Side by side, they cooked. The room that had become a battlefield in the morning slowly reclaimed its warmth through small gestures. A hand brushing another while reaching for ingredients. A brief laugh, a glance that said more than words. The ache of the day did not vanish, but it no longer owned the space. They were filling the room with themselves again. After dinner, they stepped out into the garden. The air was softer there, touched by the calm of evening. They moved among the green plants with linked hands and tired hearts slowly returning to peace. In the quiet, they spoke about the future, not with the blind confidence of people untouched by hardship, but with the sober tenderness of two people who now understood exactly what stood against them. Family pressure, social judgment, threats, class, pride, and still, under that warm, fading light, neither of them stepped away. Later, in the bedroom, they lay together with the kind of closeness that is not only physical, but protective. Jack held Tu Tien as though his arms themselves could guard her from the words that had wounded her. Their breathing gradually slowed. The tension in her body eased little by little under his warmth. Outside, the world remained uncertain. Mother Loy's warning still hung ahead of them like an unfinished storm. But inside that room, for one quiet night, love had made a place of safety. And perhaps that is what makes the story linger. Not because a mother's cruelty was defeated in one day, not because every obstacle suddenly disappeared, but because two people who could have been driven apart by humiliation instead became more certain of each other. The test came earlier and harsher than expected, and still Tu Tien chose love over money, while Jack chose loyalty over silence. By nightfall, they had not solved everything. They had done something more important. They had revealed who they truly were when love became difficult. In the end, genuine love is rarely proven in peace. It is proven when fear enters the house uninvited, when judgment sits at the kitchen table, when money is used like a weapon, and when leaving would be easier than staying. Tu Tien's tears were not weakness. They were the cost of courage. Jack's promise was not merely romantic, it was the beginning of a life decision. And maybe that is the emotional truth this story leaves behind. Love becomes real, not when two people are admired for being together, but when they choose each other after power, pride, and pain have already tried to tear them apart.